Hello and welcome to the History of Japan podcast, episode 548, The Five Mountains, Part 2. Now, last week we spent much of the episode discussing the rise of Zen, from a new sect in China to a novelty in Japanese religious circles to a major force in the cultural life of the era, thanks to the patronage of the elite. One thing we didn't talk much about is what Zen actually is, which will be important, but not as much as you might think, when we look at Zen practice in the Great Five Mountain Temples. So, as a quick refresh, Zen is a result of a cultural fusion between Buddhism and the native Chinese religious philosophy known as Taoism. The name Zen is a shortening of Zenna, which in turn is derived from dhyana, a word in Sanskrit, the language of Indian Buddhism, and really Indian philosophy and religion more generally. That word means meditation. And, as that would imply, the main focus of Zen is the pursuit of enlightenment by means of vigorous meditation. Different sects of Buddhism have different approaches to helping adherents realize the truths of the religion, the impermanence of all things, the nature of cause and effect, the cycle of rebirth, all of the teachings associated with Buddhism as a religion that you probably learned about in a world religions unit in secondary school at some point. Some sects rely on mandala visualization, images intended to help you see how this cosmology fits together. Others rely on chanting, like the Nembutsu associated with Pure Land Buddhism. For Zen, the focus is just on meditation, on just sitting and focusing on the experience of the moment itself. The precise form of that meditation can vary a bit based on teaching and lineage, but the emphasis really is always on this rigorous mental discipline that is cultivated internally in order to see the world as it truly is. That mental discipline is really geared towards reimagining your own relationship to the world. Zen is radically iconoclastic, which is a fancy way of saying that it rejects a lot of categories and ideas we take as givens. This includes attacking notions like the idea that you and I are separate beings, or that there's any clear line we can draw between the two of us, or between the contexts that we exist in. Rather than discrete individuals or specific phenomena, Zen imagines the world as an interconnected nodes of cause and effect, each of us acting on and in turn being acted upon by others, changing in response to our circumstances, and changing the circumstances of others in turn. This understanding leads in turn to the idea that all of us already have a fundamental Buddha nature, indeed everything does. We all have the potential of the Buddha within us because we are connected to the Buddhas, and everything else, by that web of cause and effect. Enlightenment isn't really something you attain, it's not an object, it is a realization about something you already have, this connection to the wider universe. All of this, really realizing it, not just hearing someone tell it to you, relies on meditation. It's a rejection of the complex ritual trappings of other types of Buddhism. And all of this is heavily influenced by Taoist teachings. You see in a lot of Taoist philosophy similar notions about the unique beauty and potential of all things. For example, the classic Chinese Taoist writer Zhuangzi has several stories in the text that shares his name about realizing that usefulness and uselessness, beauty and ugliness, all of these conventional categories are just arbitrary human inventions. Ultimately, notions of potential are all about preconceptions we bring into a conversation rather than seeing things as they really are. He of course says it more poetically and artfully, but you can definitely see echoes of those ideas in later teachings about all things having a Buddha nature, even the most humble of objects or people. Similarly, Taoism is very suspicious of language as a means of communication. Much is written in Taoist texts about the impossibility of conveying truths that can only be lived through a linguistic medium, which is always, at best, a mere shadow of actual experience. Which, as every single teenager I've ever taught these subjects to has pointed out to me, is very ironic given that, of course, we study this mostly via written texts. But of course, it might be imperfect, but the written word is still quite useful. You see this same suspicion of language in a lot of Zen history. For example, the famous Chinese monk Linji, for whom the Rinzai sect is named, supposedly did not want his disciples to write down anything he said because, and these are supposedly his exact words, students of today get nowhere because they base their understanding upon the acknowledgement of names. They inscribe the words of some old dead guy in a great big notebook, wrap it up in 4 or 5 squares of cloth, and won't let anyone look at it. That's all wrong. Blind idiots. What juice are you looking for in such dried up bones? Elsewhere, he compares people who focus on the written word too much to people eating literal crap and talking about how great it tastes. Really, a very evocative speaker. This hostility also manifests in the form of a focus on lineage when it comes to enlightenment. Zen schools commonly position themselves as legitimate based on a documented lineage of mind-to-mind transmission of enlightenment going back to Bodhidharma and from there to the Buddha, one that is very difficult to verify historically before the 700s, but which is central to the Zen claim that its practices are authentic. That mind-to-mind transmission is intended to represent a link of ideas and teachings that is more meaningful than a reading of texts by an old master could be, because it is based on actual experience, learning from a master, seeing how they live, rather than just an approximation, stories that only give you an idea of these things. Of course, Zen still uses the written word. Of course, Linji's students wrote down what he said, against their master's wishes, specifically because they felt it might be useful for future students to hear his insights. Then, of course, there are the koan, these complex metaphorical stories intended to spark realization in disciples, collected in various written volumes. The most famous of them is the Gateless Gate, in Japanese the Mumonkan. The koan are intended to be mind-bending. They're essentially a type of mental puzzle where the goal is not really to solve it as much as it is to use the puzzle to attack the student's conventional means of viewing the world. The hope is to provoke a moment of realization of the ways in which conventional categories, ideas, or notions disguise the actual unified truth of Buddha nature, cause and effect, or other Zen teachings. Now, I point all this out to start with because it seems like the sort of thing that might be poorly suited to, say, an Ashikaga shogun who is busily commanding a sprawling warrior government, managing the competing interests of his vassal houses, and of course, prosecuting a long-form civil war against a breakaway government run by a renegade element of the imperial family. In other words, for your average medieval member of the warrior aristocracy, it seems at first glance like Zen actually wouldn't be a great fit for your lifestyle. If nothing else, being told over and over again that all the worldly glory you're racking up doesn't actually mean anything because the only thing that really matters is that complex web of cause and effect, well, it seems like a hard sell. In fact, however, Zen makes for a very good elite religion. Of course, among the rank-and-file samurai, it was the more populist sects of Buddhism, Nichiren, Jodo Shinshu, stuff like that attracted followers. Their emphasis on simple chanting and a theology that solved a core samurai issue, the Buddha says don't kill things, and that's kind of my job, but the virtue of the Amida Buddha is such he can still carry a sinner like me to the Pure Land, well, that was all pretty attractive. So as the Five Mountain system was coming together in the mid-1300s, it was the elite warrior families that really made things happen. The Ashikaga shoguns, of course, took the lead, following in the footsteps of the old Hojo family, but they were not alone. Beneath them were many prominent clans who served as shugo, military governors of Japan's 60 provinces, and many of these shugo families patronized Zen as well. One of the best documented examples of this phenomenon is the Otomo family, the wealthy shugo of Bungo province. They established 6 Rinzai temples in their domains in the 1300s, mostly headed by monks from Enni's lineage, handpicked by the Otomo from the rosters of the most elite of the 5 mountain temples. One of the younger sons of the family, who would eventually become its head, Otomo Ujiyasu, even had a prominent career in the monastic system after retiring from public affairs. Another shugo family, the Ouchi, regularly sponsored the temples they patronized in the translation of Zen texts alongside other works from China such as poetry or Confucian philosophy. Remember, printing is not exactly cheap during this period, so that kind of patronage helped pay to disseminate the ideas of Zen. On balance, it's pretty clear that most of these shugo families, the great samurai clans just underneath the Ashikaga, who supported their rule, engaged in some form of patronage of Zen. So too did the branch of the imperial family which remained in Kyoto. And again, for some, interest in Zen appears to have been very sincere. For example, Otomo Ujiyasu is described as very diligently pursuing his study of the koan with monks at old Homo family temples. However, for many others, it was clear their interest in the religion was really as a marker of their own cultural refinement. Many of the monks the Shugo families were most closely associated with were either from or had been trained in China, and were thus familiar not only with Zen, but with Chinese cultural practice more generally. And remember, at this point, China is still the cultural center of the world, if you are Japanese. Zen in particular has always had a close association with the arts as well, even back in China. The pithy wordplay of a koan compares favorably to poetry, and a suspicion of the value of language meant that other ways of communicating ideas, calligraphy, painting, things like that, could be seen as equally valuable. And of course, for over 1,000 years, the mark of the educated and influential gentleman, in both China and Japan, was a facility with the arts, and if you wanted to reach those people, you had to meet them at their level. And so many of the monks who'd been to China had a strong background in the arts, and spending time with them was a way to stay abreast of the latest cultural trends in China. Or if you were a Shugo off in the provinces, spending time with the local monks was a great way to stay connected to the culture back in Kyoto, and from there back to China. And so many of these sponsored Zen monks appear to have spent just as much time teaching poetry as they did koan. Ogasawara Sadamune, a Shugo from this period who developed one of the first codes of etiquette for the warrior class, appears to have done that with the assistance of the monk Seisetsu, who spent time at Zen temples in China, and was thus very familiar with the cultural expectations of members of the Chinese elite, something that clearly informs the code Ogasawara created. Overall, the relationship between the Shugo and Zen was less about religion and more about one of the classic dynamics of medieval Japanese history. The new warrior governments of first the Minamoto, then the Hojo, and then finally the Ashikaga families had a lot of military legitimacy. After all, force was what their power was predicated on at a fundamental level. However, they didn't have a lot of cultural legitimacy. The ancient legacy of the imperial court and the aristocratic families, the cultural cachet associated with that. Patronizing Zen temples offered religious legitimacy. Ultimately, the Ashikaga and their allies did that for largely the same reasons that, say, the Fujiwara or Soga clans had patronized some of Japan's original Buddhist temples more than 600 years earlier. Any sort of connection to China, the hub of all true culture, was valuable in its own right too. The desire to gain legitimacy by patronizing these temples led to a profusion of Zen institutions that was almost ludicrous in its own way. By the mid-1300s, around the time of Ashikaga Takauji's death, there were over 300 temples in the official state-sponsored Five Mountains or Gozan system. Actually, that's probably an undercount. Many of these temples had various tachu, or branch temples, or matsuji, affiliated temples, which were also, in a sense, a part of the system. There were also, among the Five Mountains, actually 11 official temples. Kyoto and Kamakura each had their own 5 mountains. For Kamakura, they were in descending order of seniority: Kenchoji, Engakuji, Jufukuji, Jochiji, and Jomyoji. Kyoto, of course, then had its own 5 mountains: Tenryuji, Shokokuji, Kenninji, Tofukuji, and Manjuji. Originally, Kyoto's second spot had belonged to Nanzenji, built by one of the first members of the imperial family to develop an interest in Zen, the retired Emperor Kameyama. However, in 1386, the shogun Ashikaga Yoshimitsu finished building Shokokuji and wanted to add his own temple to the 5 mountains, and so he just kind of promoted Nanzenji into a sort of super spot, the singular first temple of the land, so that he could slot his own temple into the 5 mountain system. While he was not very good at counting mountains, Yoshimitsu did, at least to his credit, try to organize the next tier of ranks, the Jisatsu, or 10 temples, into just 10 temples. Well, really 20, because 10 each in Kamakura and Kyoto, but still, in principle, he did stick to the system. But later shoguns found it very advantageous to curry favor with their Shugo subordinates by, say, recognizing a temple that a Shugo family had helped fund as Jisatsu. And as a result, by the mid-1400s, in the 10-temple system there were over 40 temples. And of course there was never any limit to the number of temples in the third tier, the Shozan, or various mountains, which is why, by the end of Ashikaga rule, there were over 250 of the various mountains. Actually, while that was the end of the Five Mountains, it was not the end of the Ashikaga-backed Zen network across Japan. Starting in 1348, at the insistence of their advisor, the monk Muso Soseki, the shogun Ashikaga Takeuji and his brother Tadayoshi began to sponsor Zen temples called Ankokuji in each of Japan's 60 provinces. The term Ankokuji literally means Temple for the Serenity of the Nation, and the designation was given to prominent Zen temples in each province. Temples so designated got financial support, in exchange for which the monks were supposed to offer prayers for the memory of the warriors who'd fallen in the civil wars between Ashikaga Takeuji's puppet Northern Court and the opposing Southern Imperial Court. They were also supposed to offer prayers in particular to the memory of the retired Emperor Go-Daigo, who had overthrown the Hojo family and been overthrown in turn by Ashikaga Takeuji. In part, the purpose of this Ankokuji designation and a related designation of Rishoto, or Pagoda of the Buddha's Favor, offered to Tenzai, Ritsu, and Shingon temples for doing the same thing, was spiritual. We can't discount the fact that in 14th century Japan, a belief in the world of spirits was just common, and that in particular the notion of the vengeful dead, angry spirits whose unfulfilled ambitions or rage at their mistreatment in life could inflict misfortune on the living, was a particularly widespread idea. These temples could help pacify those spirits, and hopefully, so the thinking went, their pacification would stabilize the realm. But this was also a political choice. Praying for the dead on both sides was an act of reconciliation that might help heal the wounds of war. Of course, that was something Takeuji wanted because his side was currently winning and would eventually win outright after his death. So putting the war behind us all meant accepting the new order of things, with himself at the top. Muso Soseki likely also suggested this idea for somewhat selfish views himself. As a monk from a distant branch of the imperial family, he'd initially been associated with figures from the renegade southern court and even taught Go-Daigo about Zen. Then, of course, he had betrayed that cause and jumped to Ashikaga Takeuji as soon as it was politically expedient. The Ankokuji system was a chance for him to potentially rebuild his reputation on both sides of the conflict, burnish his own prestige among the Zen establishment by directing it, and maybe even avoid any unpleasant hauntings by those who had suffered the most from his betrayal. What I'm getting at is that by means of the Gozan system and its related temples, Zen, and Rinzai Zen in particular, had by the mid to late 1300s become an establishment religion. It was not, of course, an established faith in the way that, say, the Catholic Church was in many of the contemporary kingdoms of Europe. That was to say, it was not endorsed as the primary faith of the kingdom. Nobody was going around trying to get the peasants to give up their faith in the kami and associated spirits of Shinto, or convert temples belonging to the Shingon or Tendai or other sects to Zen. But Zen was a part and parcel of the expectations for a member of the cultural elite. And this created an atmosphere that was way more centered on cultural performance than it was on faith. Thomas Hoover sums it up well in his book Zen Experience when he says the major Zen temples, quote, had become hardly more than an umbrella for the import of Chinese technology, art, and philosophy, unquote, and that most of the monks were laymen who just wanted to learn Chinese painting and poetry and participate in the highest levels of elite culture, where knowledge of that was just an expectation. Hoover also quotes Philip Yampolsky to the effect that, quote, the monks in temples were all poets and literary figures. The use of koan, particularly those derived from the Blue Cliff Record, became a literary and educational device rather than a method for the practicing of Zen. With the Gozan system frozen in a bureaucratic mold, priests with administrative talents gained an ascendancy. In the headquarters temples, men interested in literary pursuits withdrew completely from temple affairs and devoted themselves exclusively to literature. Sure, priests gave lectures and continued to write commentaries, but the Gozan priests seemed to concern themselves more and more with trivialities. By the mid-15th century, Zen teaching had completely disappeared from the temples, and the priests devoted themselves mainly to ceremonial and administrative duties. In a certain sense, this is what you would expect given the circumstances that led to the creation of Gozan Zen. After all, many of the people patronizing these temples were interested in the cachet of being associated with a newfangled Chinese religious sect, or interested in currying favor with the elite of the Ashikaga family and their supporters by being seen in the right places, so to speak. And as Yampolsky indicates, this didn't just affect the character of the temple's parishioners. The close association between Rinzai temples and the Ashikaga shoguns meant the monks spent a lot of time on cultural preoccupations. Initiate monks at a gozan temple didn't just study sutras and learn koan, they were also taught classical Chinese poetry, how to appreciate ink paintings. All of this would allow them to mix with the patrons of the Rinzai sect socially, who were obsessed with these markers of culture and prestige and sophistication, which is going to be necessary once you hit a certain rank in the temple. As a result, a lot of these temples came to resemble less of a religious institution and more of a literary salon. In many cases, this came with a laxening of temple discipline. We have a lot of records of edicts and laws being put in place by the Ashikaga to try and clamp down on that. For example, this edict was issued in the mid-1300s. Quote, "Up till now, monks have wandered about day and night outside the temple at will. They have schemed to make money in the temple precincts, and such money-lending activities have multiplied. This has become a subject of rumors, causing a decline from the Buddha's law, and must be admonished. The abbot and temple council acting in concert must make an inspection, and a violator must be expelled from the temple without delay." Similarly, here's another from about 3 or 4 decades later. Quote, "Both elders and ordinary monks must be carefully checked for attendance at the 3 daily services. If they are absent, they must be removed from the temple rolls, and elders must not be promoted. In the Zen sect, advancement comes from the practice of rigorous Zen discipline, zazen, seated meditation, and those who have been repeatedly negligent shall be expelled from the temple." Clearly, many of the monks of this system were in it more for the prestige than the teachings, and attempts to stem that tide by means of these edicts didn't really work that well. That's why there were so many of them. Many of the temples were also heavily involved in the national economy, and especially its trade with China. Zen monks were often chosen to lead Japanese trade delegations to China. After all, they could read and write in Chinese because they had to read a lot of Buddhist text, and had a certain level of cultural cachet as monks. Involvement in trade made a lot of these temples ludicrously rich. Tenryuji, for example, built up over 150 sub-temples plus its very impressive garden complex, which you can see today, but the current ones are reconstructions, by means of sponsoring and engaging in trade trips to China. Tenryuji itself actually entered into a tributary relationship with China's Ming Dynasty. The temple entered into that relationship to gain access to trade as an institution, which made the temple just astonishingly wealthy. As a general rule, the more elite one of these temples was within the gozan system, Tenryuji for example was in the top tier, the less time was spent on religion and the more was spent on these sort of cultural and economic preoccupations. Particular lineages of Zen were also more involved in elite culture. Remember, Zen involves a complicated genealogy of mind-to-mind transmission. I get an Inca, a certificate stating my enlightenment, from my master, who got it from his master, and so on all the way back to, in theory, first Bodhidharma, the monk who established Zen in China, and then the original Buddha, Shakyamuni Buddha. The idea, of course, is the lineage represents a chain of enlightenment that's too broad to be encompassed in a simple written record of ideas, and thus it can only be recorded in the sense of being shown that it's passed from one person to another via lived experience. But this focus on a personal dynamic also meant different lineages began to evolve differently, even within Rinzai itself, and in particular lineages associated with Muso Soseki, as well as the Zen temples associated with Enni and his teacher Eisai, became very prestigious, and by prestigious I mean focused on catering to the powerful. The external form remained the same, or at least similar. All the stuff we talked about earlier in this episode about what made Zen distinct was still there. But daily practice was often more defined by catering to the wealthy than anything else. This discussion's been pretty abstract, so I think it's worth going into a bit more of a specific story to look at Gozan, Five Mountain Zen, in its final form, so to speak. We're going to do that by briefly touching on one of the most famous monks of this era, a fierce critic of this system, Ikkyu. We actually did a whole episode on Ikkyu. He's that famous, so I won't retread him too much here. If you want a fuller look at his life and the Gozan system and how it factors into it, check out episode 430. The short version is that Ikkyu was born in 1394, possibly the illegitimate child of a former emperor, though that part of his story comes from a glowing chronicle by one of his disciples, so we have some reason not to blindly trust it. As a young boy, he was sent to the Zen priesthood, first to one of the Ankokuji nation-pacifying temples, and then, when he distinguished himself in his study of Buddhist texts, to the prestigious Gozan temple of Kenninji, the third of the 5 mountains. However, young Ikkyu hated the excessive focus on catering to the desires of prestigious patrons. The temple's monks, for example, spent a lot of time training Ikkyu in the art of poetry, the classic skill of the courtly gentleman, and the sort of thing a wealthy aristocrat might come to the temple to learn instead of, Zen stuff. The idea, of course, was that Ikkyu and other initiates needed to know this to be able to mix with the elite set that patronized the temple, but it also meant less time was spent on actual religious teachings. By all accounts, Ikkyu was actually a pretty good poet. His work was published in a few compendia from the period, but over time his poetry began to shift. Gone were the more rote references to the ephemeral nature of the seasons and the transient beauty of the moon reflected in water, classic poetic themes that maybe loosely referenced Buddhist ideas about impermanence, but more for the aesthetics. Instead, Ikkyu simply wrote poems criticizing what he saw as the excessive worldliness of Kenninji itself, its concern with appealing to the wealthy and powerful. Before long, he quit, and ended up pursuing his studies at a smaller temple near Lake Biwa, affiliated with a less prestigious lineage and thus more devoted to actual religious practice. When he did finally attain his Inka, his certification of enlightenment from a master of that lineage, he didn't lose his contempt for the Zen establishment. Returning to Kyoto, he engaged with Gozan Zen, primarily to mock it. For example, Ikkyu is probably best known for suggesting very publicly, repeatedly, to anyone who would listen, that you were better off pursuing enlightenment by heading to a brothel and chatting up the prostitutes than you were listening to a Dharma talk at a Gozan temple. At one point, he bought a cheap wooden sword and went on a tear about how Gozan Zen was the same thing. It looked real, but it couldn't actually do the thing it was supposed to do. Which, as metaphorical burns go, is a bit overcomplicated, but gets the point across. Ikkyu's poems could get pretty out there. There's one famous one that continues the whole brothels are better than temples theme by using a bunch of Zen terminology to describe female genitalia, but they do get to what I think is a very valid critique of the system and others like it. The Gozan system undoubtedly helped embed Zen Buddhism in the cultural fabric of the medieval Japanese elite. Members of the Ashikaga family visited and patronized the Gozan, as did their followers, and even members of the traditional Kyoto aristocracy, hoping to curry favor with their samurai counterparts, or just interested in what was trendy. But the vast majority of people caught up in the Gozan system were involved in it not out of genuine interest in the teachings, but because the teachings were simply trendy. There is, of course, another important way in which the Gozan's cultural contributions do matter, indeed, probably the most enduring way in which they matter, and they have to do with the most famous and most derided figure in the Ashikaga period, Ashikaga Yoshimasa. Yoshimasa was the 8th Ashikaga shogun, not the last, but under his rule, the power of his family and government deteriorated to the point the Ashikaga lost control of the country, inaugurating the civil wars of the Sengoku period. Admittedly, not entirely his fault, the foundations of Ashikaga rule were always a little shaky, but Yoshimasa didn't help much as a ruler. A big part of his failure as a ruler was his preoccupation not with leadership, but with art and aesthetics, specifically art and aesthetics inspired by Rinzai Zen. Like all his family members, Yoshimasa was a patron of the Gozan, but he had no religious interest in Zen teachings. From what we can tell, he actually preferred Pure Land Buddhism. But he loved the Zen aesthetic, the focus on simplicity, clean lines, precise execution of even something simple like calligraphy. He loved the culture of the Gozan, the poetry readings, the social set they attracted, all of that. And so Yoshimasa built one of Kyoto's most spectacular temples for his retirement home, Jishoji, though it's better known today as Ginkakuji, the Temple of the Silver Pavilion. Yoshimasa retired from the shogunate in 1474 after bungling his own succession and triggering a civil war, and he hoped to spend his retirement as a Zen monk, but not in the contemplations of the ideas of the Buddha. What he wanted was everything about the gozan life that EQ despised. The parties, the social mixing, the aesthetic appeal of all of it, associated with China thanks to the role the temples played in the China trade, and thus trendy. Ginkakuji in turn became a sort of taste-making example for Japanese aesthetics that remains very influential today. Yoshimasa, for example, was the first to use movable walls, the shoji screen, to light the spaces of the interior of his new temple and to make them easy to reorganize. He pioneered ikebana, flower arranging, mostly as a way to show off his collection of expensive Chinese vases and fancy calligraphy. So in that sense, the gozan are important for helping create some of the core notions of the Japanese arts. But it's hard to escape the feeling that by the late Ashikaga years, the gozan weren't really religious institutions anymore. They were political and economic ones that were more about offering a place for the elite to mix than they were about helping people escape the karmic cycle of rebirth. When Ashikaga rule began to crumble in the late 1400s, so too did the gozan system. None of the temples ever lost their gozan designation, the system never went away in that sense, but the wealth that had been used to support the whole edifice began to dry up. Over time, all those branch temples and second and third tier ones either had to go their own way or close up shop. The gozan system ultimately did play a role in popularizing some Zen ideas among the samurai elite and making them a part of the elite classical culture of Japan, but the patronage of the shoguns came at a price. That price was that the institutions themselves became economic and cultural wings of the government bureaucracy, losing some of their transcendent religious character, some of the magic, if you will. That compromise, power and influence in exchange for a diluting of the message, is universal in my experience across history. It is the price that always comes from fusing religion to political power. The religion itself is transformed as well. It cannot act without being acted upon. It is, if you will, a mutual interdependency of all things based on their cause and effect. One final lesson, one supposes, of the Buddha nature within us all. This show is a part of the Facing Backward podcast network. You can find out more about this show and our other shows at facingbackward.com, and you can support the network at patreon.com/facingbackward. Special thanks to those who have given at our shout-out tier: Jan Leonard, Stephen Elkins, Martin Oliveira, Clark Canning, Ian Kellett, Matt Haynes, Jackie Frostocker, Monkey Sack, Alayla McCulloch, Karen Murphy, Peter Wales, Robert Prine, William Arno, Jonas Brandis, Nicholas Kroll, Jerry Spinrad, Jared Stevens, Jeffrey Dwork, Stefan Hrushka, Joshua Kane, Robbie and Kat, Jacob Key, Aaron Finkbeiner, and Anonymous Anna's Hummingbird, Mark Sai, Gil, Leslie Ikuta, Trash Taste Enjoyer, John Christopher Harrison Reese, Inoue Enryo's Ghostbusters, NihongoKaizen.com, Shimao Toshio's History of Japonesia podcast, Jennifer Pianzio, James, Brenner Podgurski Smith, A House is a Perfectly Cromulent Mascot, The Fish I Catch Are Rhodes Scholars Compared to Samuel Alito, Schmuck, and Everything Changed When the Fire Nation Attacked. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next week for a start of a two-parter on a fascinating subject, the history of dogs in Japan.